Digital at Snowy session, which is part of the Foundations and Frontiers program, where we're going to bring in partners and external speakers to kind of broaden our minds around the possibilities that will be enabled by the Foundations and Frontiers project. Today we're joined by Tata Consultancy Services, or TCS, who we're working with on Foundations and Frontiers to explore social media and the workplace. We're joined by Ashok Krish, who is TCS's Head of Social Media and Workplace Reimagination. Ashok is joining us and broadcasting live from Chennai in southern India. Ashok is a self-described blogger, humorist, madras liker and violin player, and if you Google him, you'll be exposed to his rather eclectic musical hobbies which blend the modern and the traditional to unique effect. I dare you to not marvel at his recent TED talk on turning less work and more hobbies, I think it was called. Ashok is going to talk digital disruption in the workplace, including the future of work, social collaboration in the workplace, and artificial intelligence in the workplace, amongst other things. While it's easy to point to the advancements that digital disruption and social media have made in the global context, it's probably less easy to understand the possibility around the transformation of a business such as Snowy Hydro, which is an inherently, traditional business in both our behaviours and our subject matter. So Ashok will give us some of his insights today. Welcome to Ashok. There's an opportunity for questions at the end. There's a live Google form if that's how you'd like to do it. Otherwise, you can obviously contribute, send me an email, or do it via Google Forms. And we expect this session to go for around an hour. Ashok, I'm going to mute myself and hand over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jane. And first of all, pleasure to be with all of you. Before I get started, I do have a presentation that I will share, so you will not be looking at my face in my office, so you'll be looking at that for most part. I just thought I'd say this, which is that the remarkable ease with which we were able to set this up, use Hangouts, use YouTube, you'll be surprised in how many large companies that's simply not possible. Most corporate firewalls will block YouTube, will block Hangouts, and bridging two video conferencing systems is pretty much one of the most impossible things to do. And it's also a fascinating insight into how consumer technology is simply just works. And that's a big part of this transformation that we're seeing right now. So quickly going to switch to my presentation. And maybe switch to full screen view. All right. Okay. So I had the social media and workplace reimagination practice, and it's part of the larger digital ecosystem, which is digital enterprise, which has 5 broad areas, which is mobile, social, big data, artificial intelligence, robotics, and cloud. And one of the interesting things that I do is that this team works at the intersection of all of those very specifically for the workplace. In addition to doing consumer social media. So we do have people who kind of understand how consumer social works, understand everything from all of these standard platforms in terms of Facebook, Twitter, and the newer ones like Snapchat and so on. But also more specifically, the work that we do is at the intersection of social sciences and technology. Social sciences is very important in this case because what we're seeing right now is the application of things like social network sciences in the context of the enterprise, and we'll kind of see through that. But I don't want this to be a dry academic talk, so that I thought I'll keep it reasonably provocative and hopefully spur a lot of thoughts, and then spend a good amount of time towards the end answering questions that many of you will hopefully have. Okay, I'm going to start with a very brief 2-minute introduction to myself, done in a very social way. So if you this is my Google footprint. If you search for my name, Google is going to tell you that I'm a musician, that I have a Twitter presence. This is my LinkedIn profile. I write newspaper columns. I used to do a radio show for a Chennai station till recently, and so on. My social identities on Facebook, my social identities on Twitter, for example, my resume on LinkedIn. My writings on my personal blog, my digital store where I sell stuff, and my reading list crowdsourced on Reddit, and my music on SoundCloud and my music that you can buy from iTunes. Now, part of the reason I usually do this introduction is essentially to set the context that about 6 or 7 years back.
Hey, Ashok, can we just get you to scroll through your slides because it's not changing for us?
Okay, I think it should. I'll just wait a moment while it comes to the slide that has my name.
There we go.
Yeah. Okay, all right. So,
Slide.
yeah, let me just quickly go through that. So this is my Google. I think maybe full screen is the problem. So I'm going to keep this here. All right. So this is my Google footprint, my social identities on Twitter and Facebook, my resume on LinkedIn, my writings, my digital store, my reading list on Reddit, my music on SoundCloud, and my music on iTunes. And the reason I do this introduction is usually to sort of highlight this important point that the nature of what we call expertise or identity or institutional sort of certification, if you will, has fundamentally changed, right? We've grown up in organizations and in a society where we've judged people based on the schools that they went to, the universities they graduated from, and the job designation that they hold. But when you think about the world we live in today, it's completely different. People, the most talented people are interdisciplinary. People come with multiple skills. We kind of recognize that it's more apt to describe a person based on a tag cloud of current skills as opposed to just a designation that they hold, for a certain period of time. Because we live in a completely unique era. And the reason this is a very, very unique era is the fact that not only do we not have 1.8 billion people on Facebook, the largest ever, but there's something else at play here, which I want you to understand. Right? So this is, people will often tell you that Facebook is the largest country on the planet, and so those are nice sound bites, but you have to go a little bit deeper to really understand what the implications of that are, right? And for that, we have to go through history, and it's fascinating to be a student of history and really look at how technology has changed things because you see it in context. So here's how this is, right? So there is a English sociologist called Joseph Dunbar, and he discovers, for example, that there is this hardwired limit that human beings have in forming connections with people. It's a limitation of our evolutionary past, because the average size of a Neolithic village was not more than 140 or 150. It turns out that even right now, on an average, the average human being cannot have social connections with more than 140 or 150 people. And this is called Dunbar's number. Okay? And this is the reason why army unit sizes are never greater than 150. This is the reason why the average number of people on your phone address book never exceeds 150. And this is also why even if you have 1,000 friends on Facebook, you tend to not interact with more than 150 of them at maximum. Okay? Now, when you think about this, what it also means is that when you combine it with the fact that most people never really left more than 10 miles from their home till the 18th century, what it also means is that this is the very first time that mankind is actually able to break the limitations of Dunbar's number. Classic example is that if I come to Sydney and I want to find out what are the best Italian restaurants, I can ask my 35,000 Twitter followers, most of whom I don't know, right? So this idea that you can actually reach the cognitive surplus of the society in ways never possible before, right? Is the reason why things like Wikipedia exist, the reason why crowdsourcing exists, the reason why platforms like Twitter exist, right? And so in a way, that's the reason why this is particularly unique, right? It's fascinating when you think about it, right? When you think about it right now, more people likely own a mobile phone than a toothbrush on the planet. And the reason for this is that the benefits of being hyper-connected far outweigh other things that we kind of took for granted in the past, right? Another interesting sort of snapshot. I'm going to go through a series of these things that I want you to think about, and then I'm going to start talking about how all of this applies in the context of how we think about the future of the workplace. Okay, that's the reason for this, right? So when you think about when Instagram was sold to the New York Times. Sorry, when Instagram was sold to Facebook, it was actually more valuable than the New York Times. When it was sold for $1 billion, New York Times was worth $946 million. Now think about it. A platform built by 25 kids, essentially for sharing food photography and selfies, was more valuable than the world's most widely respected newspaper. Okay. Now, what it actually tells you, despite the sarcasm there, what it actually tells you is that it represents an inflection point in how we perceive institutional power versus collective or crowdsourced power, if you will. This is not necessarily a good or a bad thing. And as we've seen from recent elections around the world, it may not necessarily be a good thing either. But the whole point is that it's changed for the good. And there's really no way of actually turning back the clock right now. So in a way, what it says is that in several situations, the value of collective wisdom will always be better and more valuable than institutional power. Right? But again, not in all cases, only in some cases. So we'll talk about that. Okay. Now, again, when you think about the fact that BuzzFeed generates more page views than the New York Times, right? This is astounding. BuzzFeed does not generate any original content. All they do is aggregate. And they personalize. And it's easy for you to find something that you find interesting. And they're able to do this like a machine. With essentially very lowly paid social media interns, right? So this is both good and bad. I mean, we'll talk about that. Now, another fascinating aspect is that no other point of time in the past have this many people on the planet have had this much access to knowledge and learning. YouTube is the first place that I go to learn anything, even if it's how to fix this problem on this printer, or how to learn carpentry, or how to learn the cello. In fact, I learned to play the cello entirely through YouTube, thanks to this one guy in Dusseldorf who puts out lengthy, brilliant videos on how to play the cello. So the amazing thing is that at no point of time has democratization of knowledge ever been at this scale. So it's now possible to learn any skill you want and be multi-skilled in a way that's never been possible before, right? It brings us to another point. We're now in an era where kids are building iPhone apps. I, as a hobby, learned to build iOS apps from an 11-year-old kid, American kid, on YouTube. He has more than 1 million views on many of his videos. He's one of the most widely watched people on YouTube. And he teaches iOS development. He's really good at it. He has about 7 or 8 apps on the App Store. So this raises a very interesting point about when you really think about the future of the IT department in any organization. What is the IT department? Why is it separate from business? If 10-year-olds can build iPhone apps, why is there a hard distinction between business and IT? And these are all sort of interesting questions for us to ponder in the future, right? Again, here's another amazing factor. More people took Harvard's online courses than actually attended Harvard. And this is not surprising at all. But the scale of it is what matters, right? The person sitting in Bangladesh, sitting in Sri Lanka, sitting in Indonesia, has access to the exact same Harvard professors that an actual student at Harvard does in a way that's never been possible before. Right? Now, I'll sort of, last 2 points are quite interesting. I want you to keep this in mind as we kind of talk about this, right? When the film Titanic, James Cameron made Titanic, it made $1 billion in its first 10 years. Right? It took a decade for the movie Titanic to gross $1 billion in all forms, right? Through box office, through television reruns, through merchandising and DVD sales and what have you, right? And it's estimated that about 1,300 people worked on making the movie Titanic. Just in contrast, the video game Fallout 4 by Ubisoft Montreal, right, was built by 18 young kids, made $750 million in its first 24 hours after launch. Okay. And this is the amazing thing is that this is not even a tangible product. This is a purely digital product, right? So when you think about digital, part of the problem we have is that we tend to apply analog metaphors. We tend to apply metaphors. We tend to apply material metaphors. Right? this is a very dematerialized world, right? So when everything is dematerialized, you have completely nonlinear effects, right? So if a company with about 25 employees sitting in Montreal can make $750 million for a video game 24 hours after its launch, we live in a completely different world, right? So, and again, another interesting example is that this is that famous Kickstarter that Zach Danger Brown did as a demonstration of the fact that it's now possible to get funding for anything. You don't have to go to a bank for it, right? He got a $37,000 funding for a potato salad recipe. I'm not kidding you. This is an actual real thing. I mean, he donated it to charity, but it was a fascinating point, which is that in a world where expertise is distributed, and it's possible for you to split your attention into multiple ways, there's very little that you can't achieve given the right kind of organizational structures. And this should actually, and a lot of the stuff that I'm showing you right here has very direct relevance inside the enterprise, right? When you look at something like Kickstarter, when you look at something like this, it also should tell you something about how you fund projects, how you fund technology investments within your company, right? Is it very centralized? Is it once a year? Is it more decentralized? Is it designed for the fail fast kind of world that Kickstarter seem to be designed for? 99% of Kickstarter projects fail, and yet it's going strong. And so last important point before I kind of get to the meat of the talk right here is that the one technology that most of us completely underestimate, although despite reading a lot of misinformation in the media, I mean, everything you read about artificial intelligence in the media is essentially wrong, because people writing about AI in the media generally don't understand AI. Very few people do. And I can't stress how much it will transform every business as we know it. And it's not just and it's mainstream in a way that we don't even recognize. Google Maps or Google Search and everything that we use on Google and Microsoft services all are powered by AI today, right? The picture that you're actually seeing here is an Amazon warehouse powered entirely by Kiva Robots, a company that Amazon bought a few years ago, right? And here's the amazing thing. The design of this warehouse is such that you would think that items would be placed in an orderly fashion, arranged by shelf, by logically, by category, so it's easy for a human to go and pick an item. No, this is a warehouse designed by big data for robots. It's actually, the items are strewn around in a very deliberately random way, so as to avoid robots from having a traffic jam when there's high demand for a single product at the same time. So let's say it's Thanksgiving, and everybody buys iPads, so it makes logical sense for them to not place all the iPads in the same place. Now, here's the reason I stress on this point is that you will start to find situations within your enterprise where decision-making through 20 or 30 years of knowledge will be obsolete in no time, giving way to more data-driven decision-making, right? And that's the amazing thing. No person with 30 years of retail experience could have designed this warehouse. It had to be designed by big data, right, for robots, right? So, and this is just a small sort of sample, and we'll kind of talk about it. So, if I had to anchor this entire thing, right? So, when you really think about it, right, the five forces, the social, big data, mobile and pervasive computing in terms of Internet of Things and sensors, particularly relevant in your industry, cloud, dematerializing IT itself, and AI and robotics, can transform everything from business models, products and services, customer segments, and channels. Those are the well understood ones. Everybody knows we need to go digital. The first four boxes are the ones everyone understands. How they transform your business processes within the organization and the workplace itself is really, really crucial, right? Because unless you do those things at the bottom, you're not going to be successful at doing the top four, right? The business models and products and services, customer segments and channels and so on, right? Having said that, let's get straight down to the workplace side of things itself, right? Now, a lot has been made in terms, and I already saw some questions about the various generations within the workplace. So at this point, apparently there's essentially 5 generations. It could be 6 pretty soon. Obviously, I think people born before 1945, not a very large bunch still working right now. But that's an interesting separate question. As as actually our age expectation keeps increasing and people keep living till 100, increasingly it does not make sense to retire at 60 and have a retirement life of 40 years. That's a separate discussion altogether, so we'll take it up later. But the interesting point that we are increasingly starting to see, and I see some of the questions there as well. The real insight here is that these hard generation boundaries don't actually exist, especially within the workplace, because your organizational culture plays a far bigger role than actually the generational demographics that you have, right? They play only a very small part, and they fade into each other, by the way, right? So you can have organizations that are bold, innovative, social, and yet have older employees, and we've seen several examples of that. Now, it's also important to remember that when you think about even things like social media, it's not a monolithic thing. Social media by itself is about a decade old now, more than a decade old, if you consider blogging and so on, right? So there are now generations of social media, right? So there are people who now say that I understand blogging, but I don't understand Twitter. People used to say that. I understand Twitter, but I don't understand Snapchat, is the next generation, right? So clearly, when you really think about the absolute current ones, what's happening with Snapchat, what's happening with more instant live streaming, kind of a sort of a social media ecosystem, you're starting to find that it's not a very simplistic thing to say that, you know, Generation Z gets social media and Generation Y or X does not. That's absolutely wrong. You know, and there are several examples of that as well. So when you think about all of these changes, when you think about all the things, all the trends that we talked about, when you think about where the world is going, etc., right? I've summarized the changes that I feel need to happen in the context of the workplace. Right? So these are the 6 broad things that need to change within the workplace pretty soon. I mean, and parts of it are happening within organizations, but these are things that organizations need to change. And these are not about technology. Technology will play a role, but again, mind you, I'm a hardcore technologist. But I've recognized that there's a lot more social science to this than technology. Technology is the simple part, and you'll relentlessly keep seeing that as I keep giving you examples. The 6 places where we see this drastic change in the way organizations work. Right? The very first one is the shift from hierarchical information flows, not hierarchies, but in hierarchical information flows to social information flows. Let me explain what I mean by that. And this is not about using, you know, Facebook or LinkedIn or giving access to Twitter or running online communities. This actually is fundamentally about how decision-making and information flows happen within the organization. And traditionally, the Industrial Revolution has meant that we arrange people in project teams. We arrange them with goals and reporting structures and so on, right? Also means that the technologies that we use also impact this behavior. Like, for example, we use email as a very classical hierarchical form of information sharing, because you pre-decide, you know, who gets to see that information. A social information flow is essentially, you know, if you're familiar with tools like Slack, is about what we call working out aloud, right? So where more people know things by default, and people use notification filters to manage what they get and so on. It's not pre-decided up front, right? So this is one interesting shift that we're seeing. And in fact, the smaller the company, the more open the information flows within the company, more collaborative decision making. The second one is quite fascinating. Are you as an organization designed for narrow focus or for ambient awareness? And don't get me wrong, narrow focus is good for many jobs. You still want your surgeon to have narrow focus and not be checking Facebook while he's doing surgery. But the interesting thing is that ambient awareness is really about creating departments that naturally cross silos, because you're constantly aware of what someone else is doing, right? And this is again a combination of how you structure your organization along with the technology that supports it, right? The third one is my favorite point. Organizations that put people in single roles will not survive, right? What used to be called attention deficit is now called continuous partial attention. Continuous partial attention is one of my favorite terms, in that it perfectly captures this idea that the most talented people in this generation are people who are able to pick up skills in a wide range of areas. People at the intersection of art and science, people at the intersection of engineering and the arts, people at the intersection of business and IT, people at the intersection of strategy and ops, right? When you think about the newer IT terminology like DevOps, this is a perfect example of that, right? What is Agile DevOps? Agile DevOps is essentially about multi-skilled people. We call them ninja developers. We call them sort of people who are capable of doing both design and development, both requirements and this, both analytics and as well as development and so on. So you're starting to see, and this is crucial because you need to have an organization that is able to surface people who are best at doing this, and they're the ones who should not be working on single projects. They are the ones who should be roving, who should be part of multiple roles in a way, right? And we're starting to see changes in how HR works as well. We shift from traditional subjective performance appraisals to a more digital quantified self, and we'll talk about that as we go along. Another important change that we're seeing, and this is an important lesson from social media, is how gamification can be subtly augmented into how you manage processes and risk and good behaviors and so on. It's traditionally worked very well in things like innovation and knowledge management and security awareness. And I'll give you some examples of where gamification has really done well, even in companies very similar to yours. And we'll talk about that. The last one is how do you set up this idea that in many situations collective wisdom is better than institutional expertise, right? And that is something that we'll continue to discuss as we go along. So, that's a lot of theory, right? So, I want to sort of jump straight into some very practical examples. Almost 6 or 7 years ago, I led an initiative under the CEO of TCS to transform the way TCS collaborated internally. So, and we sort of you will find that I'm actually focusing less on the technology. The technology, you can look at it, it's something that we built. It's sort of like Yammer. It's a combination of many things and so on. But it's got communities, and it is our intranet homepage, if you will. But the fascinating aspect is that the reason this has been so successful for us, and these are just the stats from 1 year, right? The amazing thing here is the reason this worked is that we did lots of things from a top-down standpoint. Normally you expect social media enterprise, hey, it should be a bottom-up thing. It's actually wrong, right? Mostly they just die a very quick death. Most social platforms within most enterprises never really get used or realize their potential, right? So amongst the first things we did was to do a series of like this sort of talk. We did a series of leadership hyperconnect type things, where you could directly engage with leaders. We convinced the HR head to crowdsource policy changes, which is that all HR policy changes are first thought out as a blog post. People give lots of comments and then they become policy. We introduced a gamification engine that allows you to gamify everything from security testing to even filling your timesheets on time to signing up for a bring your own device plan and so on, right? And we also introduced a way by which the only way all corporate communication had to happen, as the CEO said, nothing that needs to be said publicly in TCS should come without a like, dislike, and a comment button. And also, it helps that the CTO and so on continuously post innovation challenges with prizes and run hackathons. So we turn that continuous partial attention into a cognitive surplus, right? And what it also does, it traditionally helped us find experts on the edges of the enterprise. And so, and again, these are the things that I'm telling you. This is not new stuff. This is stuff that we did 5 or 6 years ago. Okay. Now, the things that we kind of realized is that one is that expertise is always more distributed than we think, right? And when you think about, so some examples that I want to give you on the consumer side, right? So companies like Procter & Gamble use platforms like Innocentive to solve hard problems that are best solved through mercenary innovation. So they say, hey, here's a $10,000 technology engineering problem that it'll cost me millions of dollars to invest in R&D to solve. If there's an interesting intersection of skills out there that could come together to solve this problem, you stand a chance to win $10,000. And it's been very, very successful, right? Here's another example. Allstate Insurance actually crowdsources data science, right? So they obviously they mask actual customer identifiable data, and they put out essentially gigabytes of sort of policy and court data, and put out a data science challenge that data scientists around the world with completely non-insurance underwriting skills were able to detect patterns in how people purchase policies in ways that their own underwriters could not. Because what it does is that once you dematerialize, you'll realize that the skills that you need to get to the next level don't necessarily come from the same institutional sources that you've always expected, right? The same electrical engineers and the same. So once everything gets dematerialized, everything is fundamentally software. And at that point, you're going to start to have this rich intermixing of skills that you can bring to the table. It's just like how mathematicians are now playing a huge role in genetic science, right? If machine learning and that is looking at gene data, there's no way biologists could look at terabyte strings of A, T, G, and C and come up with insights. It needs mathematicians, right? So, and it's also about designing for what we call intrinsic motivation, right? So why do people participate socially, right? And again, we are going to have a Q&A session where we will specifically discuss whether or not generational gaps play a role. They do play a partial role, but in our experience, a lot has to do with how the organization is designed and how change is communicated, and very little to do with age and so on. And it does play a role, but we'll talk about that. How do you design for intrinsic motivation is the most important thing, and often the one thing that most organizations get wrong, right? How do I design my processes for intrinsic motivation, right? How do extrinsic motivation is what people get paid. It's money, right? It's bonuses, it's prizes. Intrinsic motivation is why things like Wikipedia exist, right? Intrinsic motivation is I'm part of something huge. I'm part of curating the world's knowledge. I'm gaining mastery as a result of writing this open source code. I'm also getting the recognition of peers and collaborating with them to do something. So this whole idea of setting up for intrinsic motivation is a very, very crucial part, right? So when you really think about this, that the workplace of now and the near future is really about working out aloud, right? Usage of moving away from email and to tools like Slack, which are more open in the sense of everybody knows what everyone is doing. You're part of different threads. You can feel free to mute one and sort of focus on something else. And what it does is it creates activity streams and something called what we now call chat ops. Chat ops is chat operations in the sense that when you think about it, the one user interface that all of us use pretty much most of our day is a messaging interface. It's either something like a WhatsApp or a Viber or a Facebook Messenger or a Hangout. It's a messaging interface. And in a way, it's become the most natural and widely used user interface out there, right? It's naturally collaborative. And conversationally, it's now possible to turn anything into a conversation, right? Just like you can now chat with a Facebook bot to buy a shirt, we're starting to see the rise of chatbots within the enterprise that I'll talk about, right? So what it does is that once you bring both system information, sensor information, and human beings into a single messaging stream, lots of interesting things happen, right? And we'll see some examples, right? Clans and tribes is another fascinating change that we see. It's pioneered by Spotify. What it says is that organizations traditionally have only one form of organization, which is teams. Project teams, right? So there are hierarchies, people are organized in teams, and it's gotten things done for the last 200 years. So there's really no berating that. But what he says, what Daniel Ek says, is that there are two other ways in which you can organize people within the enterprise. Clans are essentially self-forming groups of people with different skills who come together to get something done because they've empowered themselves to get it done, right? And it sounds like a lot of theory. I'll give you an example. ING Direct in Spain, it's a large bank, part of the large giant ING group. ING Spain has about 8,000 employees or so. Okay. Smallish company by that standards. But what the CEO has actually done is that they've said, look, you're all part of these teams, you're part of these departments. But hey, here are some of the most important customer complaints that we have right now. These could be complaints about our app, about our website, because ING Direct does not have physical branches. It's purely digital. So these are the biggest things that people are complaining about. And I want people with different skills, a designer, a developer, and so on, to form teams looking at this problem, form an interdisciplinary team, and spend your spare time fixing these problems, right? So that's a plan. So it has to be sort of incentivized at a top level, where you say, and it perfectly works for innovation and sort of bold, newer initiatives and so on. And tribes are a classic new avatar of what we traditionally call communities of practice, which is people with the same skills, but distributed. But they're able to be part of one sort of community and share knowledge in a more social way than they ever did before. So AI for productivity is huge, and we'll clearly see some examples as we go along. Artificial intelligence, essentially right now within the enterprise, works at many levels, right? One is obviously its use in analyzing data patterns, analyzing customer data, and coming up with these newer patterns and so on. But more so, the use of natural language, etc., to essentially improve day-to-day productivity of the employee is now huge. And I'll show you some examples that make it clear. Learning is another interesting change that we're seeing. People don't learn in classrooms. People don't learn by paying attention, for that matter, even to 1-hour videos like this. People spend 5 minutes in trying to learn something very quickly. So this whole idea of transforming the way employees learn into more small nugget-based contextual learning is another huge thing that we're starting to see, right? So I want to talk a little bit about DevOps as a culture itself, right? So when you really think about what DevOps is, it's essentially both development and operations. And as a culture, it applies both in IT and non-IT. Let's make it very clear, right? So it started out at IT. It's something that says that people who do development should be the one that do operations. But when you really think about it, it's a larger philosophy of interdisciplinary mixing, right? The 6 things that kind of really define what this is are about, first is design thinking as a foundation, right? Not traditional business analysts. Use of dematerialization and cloud. Significantly open source friendliness, and this is very, very important. Open knowledge and open code, right? API driven design, use of AI for pervasive collaboration and so on, and continuous digital learning, right? So in a sense, the IT department of the future will not build user interfaces or apps. They will only build and deploy APIs, only build and deploy services. End users will build the apps that they need. The hackathon will be a regular feature of how apps get built in the future. As I said, if 10-year-olds can build iPhone apps, there's no reason why this can't happen in the enterprise in the near future. We've tried these experiments, and the reason I've been fortunate is that I have 2 sides of my team. One that for the last 5 or 6 years has been empowered by our CEO to try these bold experiments within TCS for our 370,000 employees. Learn from that, and then at the same time, then be able to go and help others transform their workplace digitally and so on, right? So when I talk about the fact that apps in the future will not be built by IT, and it should not just be theory. So we've tried it about 3 years back. So our entire intranet application that allows you to do everything from apply for leave, to check your calendar, to apply for claims, to book a conference bridge, clear workflows, was built entirely not by IT. It was actually built by digital enterprise using the services that IT exposed, right? So in a way, it's possible. It does take time to get that culture going in the future, but it's possible. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the use of AI at work. In the last 1 year or so, we've sort of made tremendous strides in recognizing that organizations, as they grow larger, make life horrible for their employees in ways they don't recognize. And a lot of that has to do with unusable IT and support structures. And you end up wasting a lot of time doing things that are not core activities at all. So the use of AI to help you automate that is very, very crucial. So for example, we introduced a bot called Octo. That is programmable, and in a way that you can do your own automations. So from a very simple level, I can even say, ask Octo to remind everyone in my team to do something on a certain day, and it will go and remind them repeatedly, and so on. It can do more complicated things. I could ask it to, go collect information from multiple places, collect it together, and sort of send it to me, for example. But so in a sense, when you really think about it, the future of the workplace is a socially collaborative, mobile-first, minimalist. And with the minimalist, because if you make a lot of employee services available directly, transactional services available in a conversational way, you get rid of a lot of crud, right? Is API-driven and extensible, is powered by chatbots and automation, is also user-centric, gamified, right? So when you really think about it, pervasive unified collaboration powered by AI is indeed the operating system of the enterprise. I want to give you some examples now. So these are the kinds of AI concierge services that, some of it is already live at TCS and some of it is under development. I want to be able to chat with Octo and essentially say, get me my last few months pay slips, just fill my timesheet. Get me the project status of this. I need to file a claim for the travel that I did. My LAN cable is broken, or my Wi-Fi isn't working, my Bluetooth isn't working. The bot will say, can I help raise a help desk ticket and just take care of that, right? So this idea of taking all this cognitive overload that people have in doing these kinds of support things and taking it away, what that does, that it frees up the people to actually get a lot of more spare time in being social and sharing knowledge and being part of crowdsourcing initiatives and taking on additional roles and so on. And that is indeed quite fascinating for us, right? So, but it's also more than that. We now are getting to the point where there is now a Q&A bot to which I can ask about HR policies, right? So we have 3,000 HR employees and 370,000 employees. As you might imagine, they can't answer everyone's questions. So we've taken 6 months of their answers to employees around policies, and we've trained a deep learning algorithm to essentially provide answers about policies and so on. And so this is, and it'll also tell you who's working on what, right? So when you really think about it, right, it's possible to think about the sorts of day-to-day things that you really should automate with AI, so that you free up people to work on just the things, work on how to be smarter at what it is that they're actually doing, right? Some interesting social science. We started, because we're using a more non-email like collaborative platform. It allows us to do lots of interesting analytics. I'm able to tell individuals, really quantify how they're collaborative, right? What are you working on? These are the 3 things that you seem to be spending most of your time on. Maybe you haven't been paying attention to these other threads, right? I can also tell you on an average, how quickly you respond to people. I can also tell you who do you interact with the most and who do you ignore the most. We do that naturally with email, and we never realize, right? I can also tell you whether you've been largely serious and so. So again, the point here is that these are not analytics for analytics' sake. These are really about trying to personally quantify and provide an individual a measured sense of what they're doing, right? And they decide, whether they want to change. They might decide, what, I'm responding too quickly. Maybe I should take some more time before I respond to people. The whole point here I'm trying to make is that in the larger view of what we call digital humanities, right? And we see this very constantly, and we've seen this in consumer social media. People end up inventing new metrics to prove success. I've got tremendous engagement on my community. I've got a lot of retweets. I've got this many followers on Twitter. I've got this many subscribers to my YouTube channel. And what you'll find is that a whole lot of those sort of social statistics over time really don't make sense, because you're inventing new ways. So unless they actually cascade up to the same 3 or 4 things that you measure, right? Are you making more money? Are your employees happier? I mean, is attrition lower? And essentially, that's pretty much, unless everything cascades to that, none of this is actually meaningful. So it's really important. So what we've discovered is that there is a very direct correlation between measuring certain kinds of social collaborative density within the organization and attrition and job satisfaction in those departments. And we've seen this with 5 years of data at TCS and in several of our customers. And this is really, really interesting, right? So the units that have very, very socially engaged leaders who do like blogging events, who do hackathons, who do like chat sessions, they use sort of innovation idea challenges to ideas and so on, and are generally more socially engaged and have more communities of practice. And we're seeing that there's a direct correlation with how well they do and the general employee satisfaction in those departments. And we're able to do this because of the scale at which we operate, right? So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to summarize all this entire landscape and then spend the rest of the time answering questions, because I think that's perhaps a good way to sort of, start to contextualize it for yourself itself, right? So when you think about the landscape of social, workplace reimagination, is all the way from HR. It's all the way from how you recruit, how you identify talent, right? And really think about that. It's in many cases we find that most enterprises are not identifying talent in the way they should be identifying talent. They're not looking at the right places. They're still applying some standard rules of thumb related to which universities and what kind of degrees and so on. And many of those things are increasingly meaningless. Right? So really think about how recruitment radically needs to transform. Also important to think about how you onboard employees, right? Most job dissatisfaction happens as a result of poor onboarding, right? And how you keep that employee engaged with that leadership over time, right? So this journey is critically important. So one of the interesting things that we're working on right now is this idea of what we call a mentoring bot. What it actually does is quite fascinating, right? And we're constantly wary of trying to put too much technology to solve a human problem. So what this mentoring bot actually does is it looks at events in the life of an employee. It says, okay, you joined, you've been 6 months in the organization. You're right now in a good position. If you should be mentored. You should talk to someone with 15 years of experience, right? Just have a chat, 15-minute chat, or a lunch meeting, or a cup of coffee together. And I'll set it up, right? So the bot will ping that employee and say, hey, you know what? Great, you've completed 6 months. Yeah, I want to introduce. I think you should go meet this person, right? Or unless you have someone in mind, I'll set up a meeting with them, right? What are your interests? What do you want to do? Do you want to be a technologist? Do you want to go down this path? Do you want to be a designer? And based on that person's answers, I'm going to find the right mentor. And essentially, forget mentor. It's about just getting that person to talk to someone senior, to get a perspective of how their career is going on a more regular basis. Because otherwise we kind of completely lose a lot of people simply because of size and scale, right? So again, what I'm saying is that it's possible to now start thinking of very unobtrusive technologies that can start to play a very, very crucial role in even things like mentoring. Now, crowdsourcing and innovation ecosystems is another area. So how do you tap into the cognitive surplus of your organization? How do you surface innovators and expertise that you did not know existed? Right? How do you run innovation jams and challenges and hackathons as a culture? Right? How do you gamify organizational processes? Right? How do you persuasively design them to align to employee behavior and organizational values? We have done gamification at an oil and gas company where the behavioral problem they had was that employees were engineers, and these are 50 plus engineers, were ordering parts from inventory only if the obsolescence date was well into the future. The moment it got close to that, they ordered a new part. It was costing them, they estimated, about $20 million in a year. These are expensive parts used on oil rigs and so on. And they just changed the behavior simply with the use of a gamification mechanism that said, look, the following engineers have been saving the organization so much money and also the planet by reusing some of these older parts, right? And we started giving them sort of karma points for reusing older parts and so on. And that's all it took. And at the point of transaction, when they were searching, and that's all it took. It's very subtle. It wasn't very cheesy. And it did enough to bring awareness that it was okay to use older parts. That's really what it is. Gamification isn't about cheesily gamifying everything. Right? It's fundamentally about subtly persuading or nudging someone else using lots of standard behavioral science methods. It could be, hey, look, somebody like you is doing this. Many people like you are doing this. or it's that, hey, people who are doing this seem to be doing better, and so on, right? So there's many ways in which you can use that. DevOps ecosystems, again, as we spoke about, the use of social collaboration tools within the enterprise, right? It's not about the technology. You can use Google Plus, or you can use Yammer or Jive, and none of those things will essentially take off in any meaningful way, unless you bring a certain sense of complete convergence, right? So you have to make your social collaboration platform the place where people come through. You've got to make it the place where people can collaborate and not anywhere else. You've got to bring in the convergence and the convenience of chat ops and all the concierge bots that we talked about. And that's essentially where you start to create that cognitive surplus in your employees' time, so that they can start doing other things as well, right? Emergent learning, how do you gamify learning? How do you do contextual micro learning and so on? And last but not the least, idea of analyzing how people behave in social networks is now starting to become mainstream within the enterprise, right? And the problem is that it never really worked well as long as the collaboration platform was email, because people get very nervous when you're reading through their emails. But social networks work differently, because there's an implicit assumption that what you post is reasonably public in a way, at least within the employees and so on, right? So you're able to sort of derive newer knowledge and collaboration metrics in really interesting ways, right? So as I said, I'll end with this. Technology is the simple part. Sustaining human networks digitally is much harder, and it's a continuous exercise where you'll have to constantly fail and try new things. There's no one single method here that you can simply start applying everywhere. It's something that you have to discover in terms of what works for you. And it's a journey, and we're happy to help you get there. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Ashok. That was fascinating. I did check my phone after you said that I could probably only have about 150 contacts, and I do have 593. And then I realised that a couple of them have actually shuffled off this mortal coil, so I probably really only got about 150. We've got a couple of questions, but we've just got limited time left, so you did cover a lot of territory, and a lot of this stuff may have been touched on. First question was, is there a generational factor when considering take-up of social media? And it's reflected across a few of the questions. In an organisation like ours, which would probably self-describe itself as introverted, I think John's made a point here around, narrow thinkers, or people that are, narrow thinkers sounds wrong, but deep experts in narrow fields, which was something that you touched on as well. Is there a generational factor in the take-up and usage of it? Are there any tips in kind of how to approach different organisations that may not have a natural fit with this?
Yeah.
Generation C, born after 1990, which you touched on as well, seem to be some of the adopters of this type of platform.
Yeah. So there's a great question. I saw that yesterday itself, so I've had time to think about it. And it does play a marginal role, but as I said, the organizational culture has a bigger role to play. And what we've seen historically is, and across different parts of the world, is that yes, some industries tend to be a little bit more, they find it harder to adopt some of these newer technologies. But, and in a way, and those industries, by the way, are not utilities. Utilities are not bad at all. The worst ones are usually banks and insurance companies. And the reason for that is that, one, they've always been making lots of money, and two, they've always been able to hide under the whole regulatory thing. That, we can't do this because of regulation. So in a way, the combination of that, so in some sense, what we find is that industries like, say, retail and travel are the best at adopting these things, because they're also the most paranoid, least profitable, and open to more change than ever. So in that sense, there's that broader picture that tends to play here, right? The second aspect of it, when it comes to age and the kind of people and the kind of job role and whether people will be open and so on, there's a fascinating anecdote I want to give you, one from TCS and one from a customer as well, right? We had the same issue in the early days, almost 6-7 years ago, when pretty much 90% of the participation in these kinds of social platforms was only by younger people, wasn't by the Gen X and older, right? And TCS, although most people think is a very young organization, yes, the median age is quite small, but people don't realize that we have 100,000 employees who are not Gen Y, who are still Gen X and older. Okay, and so what happened was that we kind of recognized that simply getting people to say, hey, this is an open platform, go, and it's open, it's digital, it's it's social, it's collaborative. That's not how you sell it to employees who are introverted. More naturally, the second important thing, social platforms are actually great for introverts, because introverts are actually bad at in more real life meetings. They're actually great online. In fact, the internet was built by introverts. So that's that aside. What actually happened here is that we worked with some of our senior leaders, and we said, okay, maybe we've got to phrase and sell this idea very differently. I'll give you a very simple example. Okay, so we introduced this idea of leadership life blogging. And well, a lot of senior leaders would directly face like this, a half an hour of a live event and questions being thrown by everyone. Right? In the context of a very Asian hierarchical mindset, this is a big thing. It's quite okay in the West, but in India, it's a big thing, right? So people would get negative questions and so on, right? So it took some change management there. But fascinatingly enough, many of the questions ended up being criticisms of the next level of management, the mid-level of management. So what that did is that it brought all these guys online just to go defend themselves. Okay. So therefore, what we found is the second interesting thing that we did in another customer was that the communication when we asked people to adopt this. So we had a targeted communication that essentially said to the sales guys that this is not some social, digital new age thing. For them, the problem was finding who's an expert in the organization so that they can answer a customer query. That's the primary problem that the person has, the sales problem. So we sold it as the fastest way to find an answer in the organization, right? So we said, just go try posting this question from your email. You don't have to go anywhere. So you have to help them through that change as well. So for example, we allow many of our older employees to post via email so that they still think they're actually sending emails. Okay. And so as I said, so there's many ideas that you can start using. But long story short, if you can derive a very powerful day in the life use case for every employee, and this will be different. And not only that, you've got to remove all the other alternatives. So for example, the CEO said that, hey, HR, the only place where you will publish all your news and policy updates is here. So where there will be a like, share, comment button. There's just no change. So it has to be a combination of top-down push along with some gentle persuasive nudges that's very personalized.
Thank you. Some other broad questions. We don't have time for many. How will knowledge be distributed in the digital era? We have deep experts in narrow fields. How can we democratize their knowledge and build knowledge networks to serve our traditional needs?
So this is a very fascinating area. We actually have a research partnership with Yale University in Connecticut to specifically explore how knowledge and influence networks work in today's world, specifically with digital natives. Because we've realized that it's not a very simple answer. I mean, it's easy for me to say that, hey, everyone needs to be multi-skilled. That's not true. I mean, we still want specialists. We still want surgeons to be specialists. We still want people dealing with very dangerous, expensive engineering equipment to be specialists. So this specialization is still required. But the debate is about what level of specialization and what level of general knowledge, right? Generalization is really interesting. And then the uniform answer is that more people within the enterprise need to pick up an additional skill, right? It could be something as simple as anyone in business today should understand how AI works. If not learn how to program it, should understand how it works. Should understand how big data works. Should understand how analytics in general, right? So what we find is that we tell even our engineers to go back and read statistics. And so today it's possible to do this in an entertaining way using mobile apps and tablet apps and from Coursera and Khan Academy and so on. So this idea of incentivizing everyone to pick up multi-skill is a huge benefit, right? Which brings us to then knowledge networks, because what happens is that people are more likely to network around their secondary specialization than their primary specialization. I mean, this is just a behavioral thing, because when it comes to their specialization, they believe they know better than anyone else. Now, when it comes to their additional skill, they're far more likely to form networks. So what we find is that knowledge networks tend to get formed around those additional skills that people are incentivized to pick up more than for their primary skills themselves. Right? It's very hard to get somebody who's an absolute expert in his area to connect with others, unless it's in professions that absolutely require it, like doctors do that because they have to, because of the sheer complexity of the field. But in many areas, we find that knowledge networks are often richer and denser around secondary partial knowledge than about primary knowledge. Okay? And this is something to keep in mind, and this will always be true. So this is something to think about.
And maybe just finally, I'll group a couple of them together. A couple of things that you touched on, artificial intelligence and the ability to kind of hack your way through some of the problems that you might be facing as a business. Who, in terms of hacking your way through enterprise issues, who does this well outside of the tech industry, and AI within the workforce? Are there any good examples? I think we've had a few good examples around chatbots through chatting with TCS kind of recently, but any good examples where we may not realise that we're talking to robots?
So when retail and travel are clearly the best amongst after tech. Again, as I said, it's a function of how paranoid the industry is, and you know, retail is always paranoid. I mean, they're chasing Amazon, so it's always a tough place to be. So we do even find amongst the largest retailers, for example, even companies like Walmart, who we have helped on their entire big data side of things, is they well and truly get it in a way. And it's interesting because what we find is that if you rate these industries, retail, and even amongst retailers, only amongst retailers we find is that practically anyone in the entire industry gets it, because if they don't, they're probably not in business anymore. But banks are a very different thing. Okay? Smaller banks are tremendously tech savvy, way more tech savvy than the larger banks. Okay? And larger banks, and you know, just to even take examples from within Australia, both Westpac and Commonwealth Bank of Australia, in the last 3 or 4 years, have made tremendous strides in digital and in the use of these kinds of things. But they always face this problem, which is that the problem with even organizations adopting a sort of hackathon culture and saying, hey, you can spend some amount of time, building something, getting something done, is that they very rarely find it easy to combine that hacking sort of way of culture with the mainstream. It's always kept aside, right? And I've seen this at Commonwealth Bank of Australia. They have a separate building, which is with all beanbags and fun stuff, new way of working, etc. It's a separate, very literally a separate building. Cool stuff happens there, but doesn't happen in the main office, right? So that's often a problem. Over time, I mean, all you'll do is nice, neat, little, cute-looking things, but not really transformative. The real difficult challenge is how you actually create pockets of coolness and these hackathons and so on in everywhere, right in how you're just running your day business, and that can often be disruptive, right? So in that sense, I've seen only retailers and travel and hospitality really do this. And then I would then say smaller, we're now starting to see manufacturers, specifically ones that are drastically sort of shifting into a very digital world. We're finding auto manufacturers, car manufacturers, right, who traditionally been very, very resistant to some of this stuff, right? Now realizing that in a world where there's more software in car than hardware, and also moving towards a world where there will be significant amounts of autonomous driving and so on, they have to retool their organization in unbelievable ways, right? So we find even the largest car companies now saying they are starting to make these sort of transformative shifts, and they're doing that by bringing in CIOs and CTOs not from the auto industry. And then you have financial services. As I said, the smaller ones do better. I mean, utilities for me, it's a bit of a mix. I find European utilities a little bit, at least in South Europe, some of our customers in Italy and Spain, very, very resistant to some of these newer ideas. The Nordic area utilities tend to be a lot more digitally savvy. American has always been a bit of a mix, some who are there and some who are still quite traditional and so on. But the Asian, the newer growth markets, I see utilities in India and in some parts of China and etc. They are completely digital first. So they have very little legacy. They don't have too many old legacy processes or people and so on. So that's essentially been the mix.
Any more?
Yeah. We're on time.
Thanks so much, Ashok. That kind of brings us to a close. That was a really fascinating hour, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
I like to think about it.
Thanks a lot. Ashok, have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Well.